it's at this point that I want to do something that I don't really see done much in the literature, because, and I don't want to talk about it too much, but I do want to introduce it briefly because I'm in the process of sort of sorting through this idea myself now in research that I'm currently doing on the topic. But it is fallacious. It is categorically fallacious to view, I'm arguing, to view people as perpetrators as such or victims as such. Right? This is probably one of the gravest generalizations that scholars make, is that they talk about perpetrators as a class of people. Right? They talk about victims as a class of people. And sort of logically, it's just fallacious, right? I'm not going to get into sort of the logical justification for its fallacy, but people aren't static things, right? We're not static beings. We are constantly in flux, right? You may have been uneducated at a point in your life and you've become educated. You may have been educated at a point of your life and you've lost that education. Right? We're not just perpetrators or just victims. So number 10, what I want to describe is the perpetrator victim, right? The perpetrator victim. And this idea is sort of rooted in the fact that those participating in the act of genocide, right? Individuals who participate in the act of genocide function in a flux, right? It's not just going to be the case that you're going to be perpetrators. It's not going to be the case that you're simply a victim. It's that individual's flux, right? There's this flux. And basically we look at it like this. It is the progression from victim to perpetrator or from perpetrator to victim. So we'll use 8 to represent perpetrators, 9 to represent victims, right? So let's say we have 8 here, which are perpetrators, and we have 9, a really ugly big, let me erase that 9. And we have 9 on the other side, right? So we have 8 and 9. Really, what perpetrator victim is, it's something like this, right? It's that individuals who were perpetrators at one point can become victims at another point, right? Individuals who were victims at one point can become perpetrators at some other point, right? And there's many, many, many historical examples of this occurring. Not necessarily with genocide, but with all types of atrocities, right? You can think of the Tutsi-Hutu sort of polemic, right? There was a time in which the Hutu were perpetrators of genocide against the victims, the Tutsi, right? Sort of Rwanda. There was a time where the Tutsis were perpetrators of genocide against the Hutu, right, in Burundi, and so on, right? So that classes of, to describe, the attempt to describe classes of victims as static, classes of perpetrators as static is fundamentally flawed, right? Victims can become perpetrators of genocide. Perpetrators of genocide can be victimized, right? And so on. So I think, you know, sort of being, or having some, giving a nod, giving some credence to hermeneutic analysis, that we're always in this state, this cyclical state of transformation, right? And I'm not trying to get too heady with it, but the attempt to describe victims as this static class of those who were victimized and that's all there'll ever be is just fundamentally false, right? What you can say, and what you're certainly warranted in discussing, is that with respect to this particular act of genocide between these dates in this geographical region, this class of people were classified as victims XYZ. But you can't say that these class of people in general are victims, right? There's a technical, a logical fallacy in that, and basically I'm not going to get into it, but you can't make a universal generalization. You can't make a generalization of all from what's known as an existential instantiation, from some, right? You can't go from some to all. You can go from all to some, but you can't go from some to all. You can't say that this class, this person was a perpetrator, therefore all of these people are perpetrators, right? This is fundamentally false. You can't do that. You can't universally generalize from an existential instantiation. That might be a little too heady. Sorry for those of you who didn't get it. Those of you who did get it, understand you can't go from some to all. You can go from all to some, but not the other way around. And the fundamental problem is the attempt to describe victims and perpetrators as sort of fixed states, that this is the way that they always are, just fails to have an understanding of what it means to be a perpetrator, what it means to be a victim, because it's circumstantial. It's always in flux. It's socially constructed. It's socially motivated. it's socially embedded within sort of the narrative, the historical narrative of the sort of generational tension between the class of groups or whatever it might be, right? So perpetrator victim is not anything that I'm really trying to introduce into the literature or into the idea. It's just a wake up to sort of next generation of genocide scholars, which hopefully some of you watching this, and peacekeepers, hopefully some of you watching this video will become, is to recognize that classes of people change, right? You're just not a victim always. You have the potential to become a perpetrator. You're not just the person who has the power who's perpetrating the genocide. You have the ability to be victimized. And did you know that you have the ability to be victimized, and so on. Okay. Next is, I'll erase the rest of this now. The next is number 11. Number 11 is genocidal orchestrators, right? Or in the literature they call them sometimes genocidists, G-E-N-O-C-I-D-I-S-T-S, right? Basically the same. Genocidal orchestrators or genocidists, same, right? I use them interchangeably. Those who construct an act of genocide, right? The individuals who construct or create, so it's those who construct or create, organize an act of, right, so a genocidist or a genocidal orchestrator, this is not the individual who's in the field killing individuals, right, killing other human beings, right, those are perpetrators. The people who are being killed are victims, right, and we understand that this is not in the statics, there's victims for that particular event. The genocidists or genocidal orchestrators are the group of people who sit down at a dinner table over, coffee, and sort of strategically plan the extermination of these other groups, right? And they think about the justifications that they'll use to appease the moderates, to pacify the moderates, and they think about sort of mobilizing their population of killers and sort of incentivizing their act of killing. They think about all these things. They're not necessarily going to participate in the act of genocide, but they will create the conditions for the possibility of genocide. These individuals are what you would call the masterminds, right? These are the masterminds. Right? And the masterminds are genocidists or genocidal orchestrators, doesn't really matter. I use them interchangeably. The other ones, yeah, I will do this because it's important. I'll talk about this later. The next is what's known as sovereignty. Sovereignty is an autonomous, independently governed state or nation, right? An autonomous, independently governed state is the idea of sovereignty. The United States of America is a sovereign nation. Great Britain is a sovereign nation. Ghana is a sovereign nation, and so on, right? So the idea of sovereignty, it's an autonomously, independently governed state. So you can think of this state as being sovereign. There might be an adjacent state that is sovereign as well. And obviously, anytime we're talking about discussions of sovereignty, you're always going to be talking about discussions of sort of border protection, border rights, border regulation, immigration, migration, all that stuff comes up once you start introducing sovereignty. So that usually, typically what happens is that genocide takes place within a community, right? Within the confines of a sovereign nation. It's almost always perpetuated by political leaders, those in political power within that nation, and then people who flee to the adjacent country, and they become refugees or IDPs, internally displaced persons, right? So you'll see that in Sudan, people flee from Sudan to Chad, right? And the people who are in Chad are internally displaced people or refugees that fled a genocide in the Sudan, and so on. So what'll end up happening is that people who are targeted for extermination in one country flee to an adjacent country, or even leave, maybe leave the continent to become an internally displaced person somewhere else, a refugee somewhere else, and hopefully, a citizen of some accepting, sort of receptive community.